understanding your own problems, your own peculiarities, your own relationships, you will do well to take seriously the new way of thinking about them that Freud added to all the others we already had. Marx is the same, except he doesn't focus so much on the individual, he focuses on the social. He gives us a new way of thinking about something going on in society that people hadn't understood and taken into account. Like you might not have understood or taken into account an unconscious that developed across your life and that is now active in your mind in the ways Freud says. Marx is, not to push it too far, but Marx is to social analysis a little bit of what Freud was to personal analysis. But in our culture, we permit Freud, but we taboo Marx. We really are better in our society in coping with the thought that personally we have a hidden part of ourselves that we ought to try to get a hold of. That seems even, dare I say it, liberational. You can, and the language of many psychologists is like this, you can free yourself from childhood anxieties, from sexual taboos, from the things people go to strengths for, by studying and getting to be able to think about your unconscious. But let someone come and say, yeah, and we can make our society a lot freer from all the horrible things that afflict it, war, poverty, you fill in the blank, if only we came to terms with this aspect of our society, which, until Marx made it clear, we didn't quite see, just like we didn't see the unconscious until Freud made it clear. Freud can be accommodated. Marx not. And I'll leave it to you to speculate why that might be. In any case, that's Marx's contribution. This extraordinary analysis of the production and distribution of the surplus, how it happens, and what its social consequences are. And it's really with that apparatus that I'm now going to turn and apply it to a half a dozen topics that I think will be interesting for you. But mostly here, not to go into great detail, but mainly to show you where such an analysis goes, what ideas and possibilities it opens up. So let me begin with some discussion of the capitalist class structure, this peculiarly capitalist way of appropriating and distributing surplus. And I'm going to begin with something I talked about last time, so I'm just going to summarize it here. First and foremost, Marx was and remains a moralist, an ethically driven theorist. He didn't hide it. You pick up Marx's Capital, it has none of the dry neutrality of an economics textbook that you might find in any bookstore today. There is no effort to suggest he has a perspective that rises above all petty disagreements and captures the world how it is. He's partisan, he's passionate, and it's all over the right. Indeed, it's what makes it a pleasure to read. And if you haven't done it, do it. Not just for the analytics, but for the literature. Okay, so what does Marx do? As a moralist, as an ethical thinker and writer, he detests the capitalist class structure. He thinks it's an affront to his moral sense. And he means that in a very direct way. What capitalism does in its organization of the surplus is it mobilizes masses of people to produce a surplus by labor, by working their brains and their muscles, and then it organizes that the mass of people who produce a surplus deliver that surplus automatically, every day, into the hands of a tiny number of people. And Marx is offended, right off the bat, by this grotesque inequality. A metaphor again. It's a little bit like I would hope many of you would be offended if you visited a slave plantation and you saw 500 slaves working their asses off, and then the home of the slave master, which is full of luxuries and leisure, and part of you, before you get to anything else, prima facie, right up front, there's something troubling about this arrangement. I remember a few years ago, I went for the only time in my life, because all my friends were doing this, to a warm place in the dead of winter. And I went to the island of Martinique, because they had really cheap tickets to go to Martinique. And I love France, my father is French, I speak French, so I was also in French business, but I went there in French. And I stayed for a week. And it was horrible. I never went back again because it's a beautiful place. The beaches are everything you've heard about, and the palm trees are everywhere. And the food is wonderfully fresh. Everything is nice, except the island has two kinds of people. White tourists, like me, from Europe and North America, and then an army of desperately poor black people who do all the work. And it's a little bit like trying to enjoy a meal if at the other end of the table there's a child crying with hunger. It's very hard for you to enjoy that meal. You'd have to do a kind of Giuliani, moving people out. But otherwise, if you confronted them, you would have a hard time dealing with it. Marx has this kind of reaction, that capitalism right off the bat is inappropriate. He then develops the idea. When masses of people pour their creativity into objects which are immediately taken from them, which they cannot have, which belong to somebody else who decides what to do with them, there is a sense of being literally ripped off, ripped away from your own product. And that this has real ramifications in people's self-esteem, sense of who they are, sense of their own potential, sense of their proper place in society. That is, this is not an event that has no consequences. And the fact that people are not conscious that this is happening really doesn't change much of anything. If anything, it makes it worse. Again, a metaphor. Many, many people in this society have experiences as children with something we nowadays call sex abuse. Severe, not severe, it's extremely widespread. And it is often associated with other members of your family, which complicates it 12 more ways, right? Now, even in this room, believe me, it's widespread. But we are trained in our culture to not acknowledge it, to not remember it, to not have experienced it, to have done what psychologists call dissociate from the experience as a way of coping. But the fact that you cannot, any one of you, recall, remember, recognize that it happened to you doesn't mean it hasn't got enormous effects on you. If anything, the effects are in a sense worse because not only did you have the experience, but you cannot access it in your brain to try to work it out. And if you ever go to a psychologist to help you deal with problems, you may discover you had such an experience, and then the whole idea of the psychotherapy is to enable you to work at least part of your way out of it by making yourself conscious of it over the resistances you have to do so, resistances that have a good ground in the conditions under which this happened to you, and the importance of your not dealing with it, particularly when you were a kid. So the fact that something happened to you that you're not conscious of, it doesn't mean it doesn't shape your life. If anything, it shapes it the more. Marx's argument is the same. The fact that workers are not conscious of being surplus producers for other people doesn't mean that they're conditioned that way, doesn't have enormous consequences on them. And indeed, much of Marx's work is trying to show us what some of those consequences are. Okay. Capitalism as a class structure is then composed, if you remember what we did last time and if you follow the logic, is composed of two kinds of basic troubles and tensions. First is the tension between the producer and the appropriator of the surplus. And that's really very simple. The capitalist who employs is better off the more surplus he has to reproduce his situation, to take care of his needs, to solve his problems. In other words, the capitalist is better off the greater the difference between what the worker produces and what he pays to the worker. Or to be very crude, if the workers' wages are lower, other things equal, there's more surplus for the capitalists, which you already knew. The worker, on the other hand, has exactly the opposite interest. His or her quality of life depends on how many commodities he or she can buy with the wages they're paid. So the worker struggles for more, and the capitalist struggles for less. This is, in case it hasn't occurred to you so far, a conflict of interest. This is a struggle. It's, as Marx says, it's always there. No matter how hard capitalists and even workers will try to mute it, deflect it, convince themselves it isn't. Talk about how we're all in this together. We're all in the boat together. All of that talk is, in fact, Marx says, a defensive reaction against the irreducibility of conflict, which means that capitalism as a system has at its core, in the production of all the goods and services, built into it hostility, enmity, and conflict. As a way of organizing production, Marx says, not using this word, that sucks. That's not good. That means disruption, antagonism, and struggle are always changing, challenging, and undermining production. It's as if we organized a picnic amongst all of us here, and first we did some research, and we found the two people who like each other the least, and we gave them the job together to prepare the picnic. We'd all be solid. This is not a smart way to organize production. And all the endless discussion of how production is a cooperative enterprise that needs the worker, true enough, needs the capital, true enough, and needs the land. The fact that it needs all these things doesn't hide, obscure, or negate the fact that we've organized the surplus part of it as a conflict. Well, let me say the same thing another way. Technically, we need all the different parts. That's true, of course that's true. The worker needs a machine. The worker needs raw material. The land has to provide what nature can deliver to us to work on. So technically, we need land, labor, and capital. But the technical organization of production is a completely different question from the surplus organization of production. That's a question of how we relate as people to the technical process of making things, goods and services. And if we organize our relationships so that we're at each other's throats, then Marx reaches the following conclusion. Production, society, could be organized better than capitalism has managed to do it. And to jump ahead, but to tantalize you a little bit, Marx's analysis of crises, such as the one we're living through now, or such as the one in the Great Depression of the 1930s, or such as those in the business cycles I told you about that have happened between, those crises are themselves, as I'm going to take you through before we're done today, in detail for the United States, those crises are largely shaped by the conflict between the producers and the appropriators of the surplus. I'm going to show you later how that relationship in production, in capitalism, was crucial to producing the collapse